When I was 22, I met a guy named Hunter on a dating app. We started seeing each other casually, going out on a few dates over the span of a little more than a month. At first, things seemed pretty normal. Our first date was a quick coffee meetup, more of a way to gauge if he seemed alright in person. It was short, simple, and he came across as polite. For our second date, we met at a nearby bar. We both had a few drinks, just enough to get a little buzzed, and I remember thinking he was actually pretty fun to talk to. Things took a slight turn on our third date, which was a proper dinner. Throughout the night, I started to get an odd feeling, like something wasn't quite right about him. It was nothing obvious, just small, subtle things about the way he talked and his expressions that put me on edge. I brushed it off, though, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. We ended that date with a kiss, our first and only kiss. I convinced myself that because I didn't pull away, things must have been fine. But by the time we went out for a fourth date, I was a lot less enthusiastic. We went for drinks again, but this time, I paid more attention to the way he acted. That's when the red flags started piling up. Hunter was drinking way too much and was way more physically forward than before, trying to kiss me several times even after I made it clear I wasn't comfortable with that in a public place. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I eventually said I was tired and wanted to go home. He paid the bill, and we left. As we walked to our cars, Hunter stopped me and, without much subtlety, asked if I wanted to go back to his place. I declined, using the excuse of having work the next morning. Instead of taking the hint, he kept pushing, saying he'd drive me to work the next day if I was too tired. At that point, I'd already decided there wasn't going to be a fifth date. As I drove home, trying to calm down, I noticed a car behind me making the same turns I did. My stomach sank when I realized it was Hunter's car. I texted him, asking if he was following me, and he replied immediately, saying he just wanted to make sure I got home safely. Completely freaked out, I pulled over and told him to stop following me. After hesitating for a moment, he finally drove off. I got home, locked the doors, and tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. But later that night, Hunter texted again, apologizing for getting so drunk and suggesting we do something more low-key next time, like dinner at his place. I ignored it, hoping he'd get the message. But the next morning, the text continued, shifting from apologetic to irritated when I didn't respond. When I finally texted back, trying to end things politely, Hunter's tone turned aggressive. He sent a series of angry messages, demanding to know why I'd led him on for so long if I wasn't interested. At one point, he even asked me to pay him back for half of what he'd spent on our dates. Unnerved, I blocked his number, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Soon after, I started getting a barrage of calls from a blocked number. They went on for days, but I refused to answer. Then, one evening, I came home to find a bouquet of flowers on my doorstep with a card from Hunter. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told him where I lived. Shaking, I texted him one last time from a different number, warning him to never come near me again, or I'd call the police. Then I blocked that number too. For a few days, things were quiet. But one night, while I was home alone, I woke up to the sound of faint noises coming from downstairs. My room was on the top floor of my parents' house, so there was no mistaking it. Heart pounding, I slid off my bed and crawled underneath it, clutching my phone as I dialed 911. As I lay there, holding my breath, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and my bedroom door creak open. Drawers opened and shut, and then the bed above me dipped slightly as someone sat down. Peering out from under the bed skirt, I could just make out the outline of a pair of shoes. I stayed as still as possible, my heart racing, until finally, the weight lifted and the intruder left the room. The police arrived minutes later, finding one of the downstairs windows unlocked. I told them everything, including my suspicions about Hunter, but without proof, there was little they could do beyond advising me to get a restraining order. I moved out soon after, but even now, I occasionally find myself looking over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of that night. I was in 6th grade when this happened, just around Halloween. My school was hosting a Halloween carnival, and I would stay late to help decorate the haunted house with some friends. It was a lot of fun, and the promise of free pizza for helping out didn't hurt either. Among the group of kids who stayed late was a boy named Chris. He seemed normal enough, friendly, a bit shy, but overall harmless. We got along fine and even chatted a bit while we worked. A couple of weeks later, a group of girls in my grade approached me, practically buzzing with excitement. They told me I had a secret admirer who was going to text me that night. I was both nervous and curious, wondering who it might be. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I got a message notification. It was from Chris. I'd completely forgotten that I'd added him on Facebook around Halloween. The message started innocently enough, just a simple, "Hey," but quickly escalated into a full-blown confession of his feelings for me. He wrote this long paragraph about how he'd liked me since Halloween, how he'd been trying to impress me during recess with his soccer skills, and how he couldn't stand being ignored anymore. At the end, he asked if I would be his girlfriend. I was completely caught off guard and honestly a little creeped out. I barely knew this kid. Trying to be nice, I told him I didn't feel the same way but that I hoped we could still be friends. That answer didn't go over well. Chris started asking why I didn't like him, demanding an explanation, and each time I tried to gently shut him down, he came back with more questions. Eventually, he stopped replying, but I was left feeling uneasy. The next day at school was a nightmare. Chris's friends kept coming up to me with smirks, saying things like, "Chris wants to kiss you," and making it clear he told them everything. At one point, one of them even said that Chris would do it whether I wanted him to or not. Feeling scared, I told my teacher, who advised me to stay inside during recess and lunch. Not satisfied, I went to the principal, hoping for a stronger response. Instead, I got called into the counselor's office, where she proceeded to tell me that boys will be boys, and that I should feel flattered by the attention. I left that meeting feeling more hopeless and angry than ever. Even at 12 years old, I knew something was seriously wrong with what she'd said. The harassment continued. Chris's friends wouldn't leave me alone, and every day I dreaded going to school. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find a folded piece of paper on my doorstep. It was addressed to me, and the handwriting was unmistakably Chris's. The note said there was a surprise waiting for me under my brother's car in the driveway. Nervous, I called my mom, who checked but didn't find anything. However, strangely enough, my brother's car stopped working soon after. We never figured out what happened, but the timing was too suspicious to ignore. That wasn't the worst of it, though. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint tap on my window. My room was on the 2nd floor, so at first I thought it must have been a bird or something. But then it happened again. And again. Gathering my courage, I pulled the curtain back slightly and my heart dropped. Standing below my window, holding a handful of rocks, was Chris. He was looking directly up at me, his face half lit by the glow of the street lamp. When he realized I'd seen him, he mouthed something I couldn't make out. I panicked, dropping the curtain and rushing to check if all the windows and doors were locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. When I got back to my room, my phone buzzed with 4 new messages from Chris. They ranged from pleading, "I just want to talk," to accusatory, "You're not who I thought you were." Feeling sick to my stomach, I blocked his number. Thankfully, the rock throwing stopped after that, but the fear didn't. I told my mom everything the next day, including what the counselor had said, and she was furious. She stormed into the school, demanding answers, and I was called into the principal's office again, this time with my mom present. I remember her shouting, "Are you waiting for something worse to happen before you do anything?" Her voice shook with rage, and I'd never been more grateful to have her on my side. Despite my mom's threats and complaints, though, it didn't seem like the school did much of anything. Chris kept his distance after that, at least physically, but I'd still catch him staring at me from across the hall or see his friends whispering and glancing my way. The worst part was that I still had to see him every day, all the way through high school. The last thing I heard about him was that he'd been arrested, but I never found out why. To this day, the memory of that counselor's words makes my blood boil. The idea that someone could brush off that kind of behavior as a compliment to a sixth grader is beyond disturbing. I just hope she's not still working with kids. I've always been a bit of a loner. Even when I was a kid, I struggled to make friends and felt more comfortable keeping to myself. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had a decent job and managed to buy my own townhouse in my hometown. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was nice enough and gave me a sense of independence. I was still awkward around people, especially women, but I'd made a few close friends, and that was enough for me. When I was 23, I decided to try out Tinder, figuring it couldn't hurt to put myself out there. That's how I met Emily. She was pretty, seemed genuinely interested in me, and didn't mind my slightly awkward demeanor. Things moved fast. After a few dates, we were officially a couple, and for a while, I was genuinely happy. But as the weeks went on, I started noticing things about her that made me uneasy. Emily texted constantly, expecting immediate replies, and if I took too long to respond, she'd follow up with question marks or even call me repeatedly until I answered. At first, I brushed it off, thinking she was just really into me. But then one night, while we were hanging out at my place, she insisted we share our phone locations. I didn't have anything to hide, so I agreed, even though the idea made me uncomfortable. That decision turned out to be a huge mistake. Emily started checking my location obsessively, questioning me if I was somewhere she didn't expect or if I was with someone she didn't know. One Friday night, I was at my friend Phil's house with a few of the guys, just hanging out and playing video games. I hadn't been responding to her texts because I was focused on the game, and my phone was on silent. Out of nowhere, Emily showed up at Phil's house. Phil's mom was the one who let her in, and she came storming downstairs, her face twisted with rage. She immediately started yelling at me in front of all my friends, demanding to know why I wasn't answering her texts and accusing me of trying to avoid her. Completely humiliated, I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. Eventually, I had to leave with her just to defuse the situation. That incident was my breaking point. After I got home, I texted her, saying we needed a break and that I needed some space. In hindsight, I probably should have done it in person, but I was honestly scared of how she'd react. As I expected, it didn't go well. My phone started blowing up with texts and calls almost immediately, ranging from desperate apologies to outright furious accusations. When I stopped replying, the doorbell started ringing. Emily was outside, pounding on the door, shouting for me to open up. I was too scared to move, just listening to her scream and bang on the door. It was so bad that my neighbor eventually came out to see what was happening. I heard Emily scream at him that I was a piece of shit before finally getting in her car and driving off. That should have been the end of it, but things only got worse. The next night, I was home alone, trying to relax and watch a movie. I just put some food in the microwave when I heard a faint thud from the dining room. My townhouse had a circular layout on the first floor, with the kitchen leading to the dining room, which led to the living room, and then back around to the kitchen. The dining room also had a door that I always kept shut. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I muted the TV and stood perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of the door between the dining room and the den slowly creaking open. My heart started pounding as I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find and dialed 911 with shaking hands. I spoke loudly, hoping whoever was in the house would hear me talking to the police. I told the dispatcher that I thought my ex-girlfriend had broken in and begged them to send someone quickly. The dispatcher advised me to get outside if I could, so I slipped out the front door and waited in the cold, clutching the knife and watching the house like it might swallow me whole. A police car pulled up surprisingly fast, and after explaining the situation, I followed the officer inside. We did a complete sweep of the house, every room, every closet, even the crawl space and the attic. There was no one there. The officer seemed to believe me, though, and told me to call again if I heard anything else. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I was so rattled I couldn't even finish my food. I locked my bedroom door that night and tried to sleep, but every little creak and groan the house made set my nerves on edge. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was woken up by a series of texts from an unknown number. The messages were long and frantic, full of apologies and desperate pleas to talk. It didn't take long to realize it was Emily. She begged me to meet her in person, saying she needed closure, saying she couldn't sleep without hearing my voice. I was typing out a reply telling her to leave me alone when I heard a muffled scream from inside my room. Before I could react, the closet door burst open, and Emily came charging out, a knife in her hand and a wild look in her eyes. I barely had time to react. I threw myself out of bed, bolted for the door, and managed to slam it shut behind me. She started stabbing the door, shrieking, the knife blade piercing through the wood mere inches from my face. Terrified and running on pure adrenaline, I shouted through the door that I loved her, that we could work things out if she just calmed down. To my shock, it worked. She stopped stabbing and started sobbing, saying she was sorry and that she just wanted to talk. I took the chance to call 911 again, speaking in a low whisper and giving my address as I braced myself against the door. The wait for the police felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes. When they finally arrived, they didn't hesitate, kicking down the front door and storming upstairs. They cuffed Emily and dragged her out while she thrashed and screamed. Even then, I couldn't process what had just happened. I was in shock. The aftermath was a nightmare of police reports, court dates, and restraining orders. Emily was charged and eventually sent to prison, but even knowing she was locked up didn't make me feel safe. I moved out of that townhouse as soon as I could, but the trauma stuck with me. I still can't sleep with the closet door open, and any unexpected noise in the night sends my heart racing. The worst part is knowing how easily I'd missed the signs, how I brushed off her obsessive behavior because I was so desperate for affection. I don't think I'll ever fully get over what happened.